Welcome to Beyond Transcripts, the podcast for educators who want to meet and exceed best practices in transcripts and education management. On this episode of Beyond Transcripts, we're joined once again by Holly Erbach. She's a fantastic guest who has years and years of homeschooling experience. And she's going to help us today tackle a very important question for the parents. Can you work and homeschool? You might already be homeschooling and you're working from home, outside of the house, or perhaps you're considering starting homeschooling, but you're really uncertain if you can do that and work. Well, nowadays, many households are two-income families, and you can still homeschool. So we're talking about some strategies and tips so that you can do both and do both well, because it absolutely can happen. And we also talk about the importance of a homeschool community so that you have people that support you, so that you can use resources like enrichment programs to help your kids while you are at work. So the truth is, it might be a challenge, but it's definitely doable. And we've got some great ideas for you to apply if you are a parent who works and you're homeschooling, or you're considering taking that dip into the homeschooling pool and you know you're going to need to work as well. Stick around. We are so excited to have back on the podcast Holly Erbach. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Good. Well, if anyone's been listening for a while, we've had Holly on a few episodes. And I'm excited to talk about this one today. As a working mom, I always find this topic so fascinating to hear other people and what they do. And especially in the homeschooling community, as we've mentioned on other episodes, usually you've got someone who's got to stay home and homeschool your kids, right?
Well, generally, but the climate has been changing, and a lot of families are two-income families, and they are also homeschooling.
Yes. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, give us a little bit of background on you, your homeschooling journey, and how work fit in for you.
Well, so I have homeschooled since 1993, and for most of those years, I have had some type of a job, either a work-for-myself job based from home or going out and working for someone else. And the reason for this is my husband had sustained a severe brain injury, and he was unable to work full-time starting in 2002. And so it was necessary for me to find something to do to help supplement our income. And previous to that, I also worked out of the home as an administrative assistant and as an editorial assistant for some small business owners, because when you're homeschooling, you have 5 kids and you want some really cool curriculum, you might need to get a little bit of extra money in the door. And that's where I found myself. So I've worked on and off throughout the whole time I've been homeschooling my children.
And as a homeschooling parent who also works, do you have a preference, or do you find it one easier or more challenging working from home versus working out of the home?
Well, when you're working out of the home, your family can't interrupt you as much as they can when you're working in the home. I currently work from home, and there's a lot of people coming into my home office asking me questions while I am trying to do my work. So sometimes it's easier if you can get out of the home to do your work.
Absolutely. I can definitely relate. So you kind of touched on this, but what trends have you seen with a parent being home full-time with their kids while homeschooling versus what seems to be the trend now? As you kind of mentioned, there's a lot of two-income households.
Yeah, so I started homeschooling in 1993, and at that time, it was rare to meet a homeschooling mother who worked outside of the home. Most of the families who were homeschool families, the father was working full-time or more to support what I say is the school lunch program, right? He had to go to work and feed the kids, get the money to feed the kids. And we wives worked hard to stretch the income that our husbands created as far as possible. We swapped curriculum and clothes and recipes designed to make the most of the available items we had and tried to stretch that income as far as possible. But things have changed. I think starting about 2007, I began meeting a lot more homeschoolers who were working, and I myself was working at the time.
Yeah, and so if you have a family that has 2 parents working out of the house, how do you make homeschooling happen? Because someone has to be home, right? Schooling. And
well, that would definitely be optimal. Yeah, so in my situation, my husband had a job for a while where he went to work around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and he worked like from 2 to 10. In that scenario, I went to work in the morning, and I worked from 8 to noon, and then I would come home. So there was someone at home at all times with our children, and I left worksheets and things for them to complete, things they could do on their own while I was gone. My husband supervised them, making sure that they ate breakfast and did their chores and they had their lunch. Then I came home and we swapped, and he left to go to do his work. In another scenario, my children were older when they were teenagers, and I also elected to work in the morning at that time because teenagers like to sleep. So they got to sleep in, then they'd get up, have their breakfast, do their chores. And when I got home, we would start the school day, and we'd school maybe from about 1 to 5, 1 to 6.
I love that. And I'm sure if people are already homeschooling or they're considering making that switch, the flexibility and the options that you have are part of what can be very appealing, not just in the structure of your day, but how you ultimately teach the lessons that kids need to know.
Yes, and some families elect to use computerized curriculum. If the parent is working from home, then the options are a lot more varied than if the parent has to leave home to do the work.
That definitely makes sense. So any tips? Let's start with the parents maybe working outside of the home. I love that idea of, if you can, with your partner, sort of the different schedules so that one person can maybe be home at a different part of the day, not looking at it as the traditional school day has to happen from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. So with your older kids, shifting that to when you came home from work. Any other tips you have for parents who are working out of the home and want to homeschool their children?
Well, if both parents need to be out of the home, and I had a friend who had that situation, she started homeschooling one of her children when he was, I believe he was 13. So he was old enough to be at home alone during the day. She gave him assignments to work on his own, and we're in Texas. This is where this occurred. Other states may have different parameters, but she gave him work to do at home while she and her husband were away. And then when they came home at the end of the day, she reviewed the work her son had done, instructed him in anything that he needed additional information from her on. And then they just went about the rest of their day having dinner together, doing extracurricular activities. So because he was older, that worked. Some people enroll their children in a 1 or 2 day a week enrichment program, and they work on those days while the children are under someone else's care and supervision. So there are a lot of ways to accomplish that if you have to be out of the home.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And, we'll talk a little bit more about the community that you have around you in just a minute, but those are great things to look into, is what exists around you. You think of after school enrichment activities, but it's becoming more and more common that there are daytime enrichment activities for homeschooling kids. And that makes complete sense that you can put your kids in those programs while you go to work, and then you can do your sort of at-home schooling at a different point in time.
Yes, and I also know some people who have jobs where they can do the bulk of their work on the weekends, such as nurses. I have several friends who work 2 12-hour shifts on Saturday and Sunday, and then they're home all week. So your job, the type of job you have, is also a factor.
Absolutely. Now, if someone is working from home, and both you and I work from home, so we know how challenging that can actually be if you have to get work done and your kids are around. What are your tips for homeschooling when you work from home? Some of those ideas might still apply, but what about for this group?
Well, so currently that's the situation in which I find myself. I have a 6-year-old. He's doing kindergarten. And today we did his work before I was ready to do this podcast with you. So we shift his work around based on if I have a project for one of my clients that's time sensitive, then I might work in the morning and we school in the afternoon. And during the time I'm working, he can play with educational toys or watch educational videos, or sometimes he just gets to watch something he likes on Netflix and realizes that he's switching his TV time from the afternoon to the morning. We kind of move it around. But other times, depending on the kind of work you do, I'm not really it's not really a situation where if my child comes into my office that he's interrupting anybody else. So he can come in and talk to me, and I can still keep working. The age of the child matters a lot. When he was younger, I did a lot of work when he was napping or once he went to bed for the night, and I didn't get as much done during the times when he was awake because he was in need of a lot of supervision.
Yeah, absolutely. The age of your kids, their needs, your work, and the demands of it will obviously influence, which tips you can use. But yeah, I think there are a lot of great options, whether you're working out of the home or you're working from home, to be able to adjust so that you can also homeschool your children. Now, we touched on this, but how does a homeschool community fit into supporting working and even non-working homeschooling parents?
So the homeschool community is really supportive of anyone who's homeschooling, and there are different options that you might be able to utilize to help make sure your children are getting a good education. One is a homeschool co-op, and now this does require the parent to show up once a week or every 2 weeks, however the co-op set up to participate. But it does mean that a lot of the needs of your children will get met in that day. For example, subject matter that you might have a hard time teaching on your own. And then there are also a lot of enrichment academies that have sprung up. And I had one myself where students arrived on Monday and they were there for a full day. And the parents would drop the kids off and go home to do their work. So there are supports for homeschool families that are working or not working. I think really a bigger consideration is to look at your schedule and the curriculum you're using and how you're going to deal with housework and meals and outside commitments. Those things, once you get them under control, they make working and homeschooling a lot easier.
Right. I can imagine how kind of getting everything organized just helps you tackle those homeschooling, I don't want to say challenges, but homeschooling realities and working realities, and kind of have a plan for how you're going to do that. And I think, having that community of people around you is really important. If someone feels like, they don't have a large in-person community, people close by, are there online resources? Obviously, that wouldn't help from a working standpoint, but even just supporting a homeschooling family, are there online options?
Well, I think if you look to Facebook groups, you find a lot of support for whatever spot you're in. So in my community, we have several active Facebook groups where we can go and ask questions and get advice and information on how to address the problem we're facing with homeschooling.
Yeah, and I could see where that would be really helpful for especially working parents, just to kind of put it out there and say, here's what's going on, whether it's kind of brainstorming how to get your work done and your homeschooling, maybe even asking what jobs people have found most flexible if they're thinking of a career change. Maybe they're wanting to step into homeschooling, but their current work life doesn't really support that. Yeah, I could see where those online groups would be really useful to have, in addition to ideally a face-to-face community that you can lean on.
Exactly. Yeah, and one of the biggest things is you can ask people what kind of curriculum they're using and how much time it takes. And so a lot of people have this idealistic plan that they're going to do this really in-depth curriculum with their kids. It would be lovely, but it's not going to work if you actually only have 4 hours in your day to work with your students. So the choice of curriculum and how a curriculum works is really important when you're homeschooling and working.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So for our families who are homeschooling and have one parent or more working, are there any additional resources for them to be aware of or additional support that they can find or lean on?
I can't think of anything specific. I know when I was realizing that I was going to have to work the whole time I was homeschooling my children, once my husband had this head injury, I actually had to sit down and look at our family's rhythms and develop a workable schedule. So, for example, that's why I worked in the morning when I had teenagers that I was homeschooling, because when I tried to do school with them in the morning and then go to work, I had students who were pretty brain dead. And when I switched it and I worked while they were still just getting up and all, and I got home, I came home to people who had been awake, who had eaten, actually had on clothing, and their brains were ready to be stimulated. And so I think really in this case, while you can get support from other people or maybe get advice or insight from people who've gone this path, it's so individual that you really have to take a close look at your schedule, the curriculum you're using, and how you're going to deal with things that everybody has to deal with. You have to keep at least a modicum of cleanliness in your home, or somebody's going to be sick. You have to eat, and your kids are going to have some outside commitments. So you have to sit down with your family and talk about this. And what we did is on Sunday every week, we would sit down and we would say, okay, who's got what going on? Okay, it's 4-H this Monday night, so we're going to have to get 4-H. There's Boy Scouts. Oh, my kid has a part-time job. What days do you have to be at work? How are you going to get there? You know, those kinds of things. Having a really good calendar that everyone can access is probably one of the biggest helps when you have a lot of activity in your house. Parents working, kids being involved in activities, getting school done. I think that's a really big help, is to have a central calendar. Everybody knows what's going on.
Absolutely. And I love that this is such an optimistic message. You know, I could see where, you know, families might want to step into homeschooling for a variety of reasons, but feel like we can't make it work because we're both working, or maybe I'm a single parent and I work. So I just love that, you know, you've given so many ideas about how to make that work and how to be flexible, and that it's not, you know, that traditional school day that you might be familiar with when you're in a traditional classroom environment.
Right. That's one of the perks of homeschooling, is that it doesn't have to take place inside of certain hours. Now, everyone needs to know what their state rules and regulations are. But even within that framework, because some states are very restrictive, you can still find a way to work and to homeschool your children and meet those requirements.
Well, that's great. Well, we started with the question, can you work and homeschool? And we have answered it. Yes, you can. You'll have some thinking and planning to do, and you might have to get creative, but it can definitely happen. Any final thoughts for us today, Holly?
I would just say that you need to make sure that you are getting your rest, because when you're juggling a lot of things, you can't do it when you have no rest at all. So that's really important. And I'm talking to myself here because I was up this morning until 2 a.m. and then I got up at 9. So you just have to make sure you give yourself time to rest so that you can get all these things done.
Absolutely, because as the parent who is doing the homeschooling and the working, you're doing a lot, and you're probably doing a lot of other things too. So that's a really great reminder to make sure you're taking care of yourself and you're getting rest. So thank you again, Holly, for being on this episode. We really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
Once again, Holly has given us some fantastic advice and resources that are going to help support you in your homeschooling journey if you're a working parent or are considering working or homeschooling and wondering how those two things can possibly go together. So hopefully, as you saw, it's very optimistic. You can do both well. If you also need some more support on your transcripts, don't forget we have a 2-week free trial for you. And we also have a fantastic newsletter that'll be delivered right to you. So don't forget to sign up for that.